Hi everyone! Welcome again to my Anatomy and Physiology 2 class this semester. For those of you that have taken my A&P 1 class, remember we have ended the semester by talking about the autonomic nervous system and mentioned a lot last semester about how the main theme of this semester will be on the control of homeostasis. We have already talked a lot about how the nervous system controls our body by electrical impulses and how signals are sent and received via action potentials and neurotransmitter. And hence, to kick off this semester, we will start with the other main organ system for communication and control of homeostasis for our body, the endocrine system. And thankfully, this particular organ system is a lot simpler than the nervous system and doesn't have to be divided into 6 chapters like the brain and spinal cord and all those sensory receptors we talked about last semester. I would say that other than having a lot of parts to memorize, as with all chapters for A&P, endocrine system is actually, one of the more straightforward, easy chapters. You will very soon see what I mean by the time we get to the heart chapter. Heart as in your cardiovascular system. But the more difficult chapters, I usually have scheduled them for 2 lecture days. Okay. And for those of you that just started taking 2402 with me this semester, I usually divide my lectures into an hour time frame. So make sure after part 1, you can find another time to watch part 2 if you like. And especially on the days where the chapters are divided into 2 days, feel free to divide the parts into those 2 days that you're allowed to watch the lecture videos. Okay. But however, what pace you want to listen to them at, it's completely fine with me. And as I've suggested in my introductory video, make sure you either have a printout or have a blank sheet of paper in front of you so you can take notes as I'm going over all the important stuff for this chapter. And sometimes I give you hints here and there on how to easily remember this terminology or that terminology and so on and so forth. Okay. All right. So let's get started. Since this semester is all about homeostasis, we will begin by reviewing with you what homeostasis is, which defines as keeping a stable internal environment that is vital to an organism's survival. For example, we talked about the body temperature and blood calcium ion level homeostasis last semester. How we said that, when your body temperature drops, you will shiver in response. So that's why your muscle fibers, in a sense, was able to generate heat for your body, and how we talked about things your osteoclast will do or what your kidney will make in response to too low in calcium ion concentration in your blood. We talked about all those last semester from Bio 2401 within the bone chapter. So this semester, we will understand how our body can regulate our blood pressure, for example, pH, okay? And all of these have to be maintain within a pretty narrow range of each other, okay? And we will also talk about how our body can regulate oxygen, carbon dioxide content, water content, etc. That's just a few of those we will talk about because with every organ system that we're going to talk about this semester, we will have homeostasis theme throughout the entire semester, because that's basically what all the other organ system is doing for us, is keeping us alive by being able to maintain those homeostatic ranges so that we don't get sick. Whenever those different values of our body, measurement of our blood pressure, measurement of our pH, we end up with a disease. So that's in a sense how we get sick, is when our body goes out of our homeostasis. And somehow, because maybe we have a bacterial infection, maybe we're infected with a virus, we're sick, that's why we cannot use our own body's automatic homeostatic mechanism to bring our levels back to normal temperature. And that's why we need the intervention of medication, vaccination, etc. Okay, so all these activities can only be regulated if organs, tissues, and cells are all coordinated to work together by being able to communicate with each other by sending and receiving those chemical messages using both the endocrine system and the nervous system. For endocrine communication, the chemical messengers are not called neurotransmitter. That's what we talked about last semester with the nervous system. For endocrine communication, we call those chemical messengers hormones. And because they don't travel via neurons or synaptic clefts, but via our bloodstream, okay? And that's why, because they go through our circulatory system, they can almost reach anywhere within the body, even if it was a it was a body part that was more distant away from the original endocrine gland. So that's something different from the nervous system. Nervous system, neurotransmitter, we're traveling across a synaptic cleft, but for endocrine system, the little chemical messengers called hormones are traveling into the blood, and then they can travel pretty much to anywhere within the body where there's blood vessels. Now, just as we have presynaptic neurons and postsynaptic neurons for the nervous system, for endocrine system, we will talk about the organs that are in charge of releasing hormones into the blood and the target cells that have specific receptors for these hormones. Okay, so we're talking about target cells, which is analogous to our postsynaptic neuron or our muscle fiber, if you remember neuromuscular junction from last semester. Or presynaptic neuron would be your actual endocrine organ that is releasing those those hormones. Okay, all right. And since the endocrine system is for communication, that means it needs to send a message across to complete a specific job. And hence, upon binding to these circulating hormones, which are just the message, the target cells usually have to do something in response, which can be turning on something or turning off a pathway that may initiate or terminate synthesis of a particular protein, for example, or modify the physical structure or biochemical properties of these cells. For example, making muscle or liver cells more permeable to glucose for their removal from the bloodstream upon binding to insulin. That's the whole purpose of insulin. Insulin is a hormone that is released by the pancreas, as most of you know. And that insulin is going to circulate around your entire body and activate all those muscle cells you have and liver cells as well, because those particular cells have receptors for insulin to bind to. And once insulin binds to those receptors, it activates them to remove blood glucose from your bloodstream and into themselves. So we never have a high blood glucose level, after eating a meal. It will come back down pretty soon once your muscle and liver cells can absorb all of those back. Okay, I will come back to this idea when we get to the pancreas part of the chapter. We will go over all the endocrine, primary endocrine organs in this chapter. Now, because hormones are released into the bloodstream that circulates throughout the entire body, one single hormone, a lot of times can alter metabolic activities of multiple tissues and organs at the same time. And that one hormone may not have the same effect in every organ. Okay, so that's what is different for endocrine system, again, from the nervous system. We can activate multiple things at the same time with just one release of one type of hormone. The function of the hormone may not be determined by the chemical nature of the hormone, but usually the function of what the hormone does is determined by the receptor target cells instead. Okay, so make sure you remember that. Okay, so for hormone function is determined by target cells. Okay, by those target cells. Kind of like, your boss is sending out one single email to everyone at the company with the task or project that needs to be done, but the IT department will complete their task using their IT software. The administrative department will need to make phone calls to their clients. The graphic design department will need to draw their ideas down using an illustration program. It was one single email, one single message, the same email to every department in the company, but the resulting function in each department differs based on what they are in charge to do for the company. And now that's the same thing for the body. One message in form of a hormone, the same hormone throughout, same chemical makeup, but the resulting function may differ based on what that particular organ or cell is in charge of doing for our body. So that's how, when we talk about hormone is not, sometimes it's not the saying that this hormone is forever going to do this. It depends which is the effector organ that hormone will bind to. Okay? All right. And compare with neurotransmitters, we talked about with the nervous system, effects of hormones appear very slowly, and it may last for days. So not only are the effects a lot slower, but they can also, you can look at it, the effects in more long-term status. As long as a hormone is still viable within the bloodstream, chemicals have half-life in our body. Some are degraded by some other enzymes, some are diffuse away into the kidneys, for example. So whatever it is, but yet it is still a lot longer in the bloodstream when we compare with how long neurotransmitters are able to be, present within the synaptic cleft. Okay, so hormones will always continue to activate whatever it needs to activate as long as it is still in the bloodstream and the chemical is still viable, which is why the endocrine system is very effective for controlling activities that are necessary for growth, development, and metabolism on a long-term basis. Okay, so remember that the effects are slow, but it will last for a long time, and we're talking about more long-term type of effect. If you remember from last semester, synaptic communication via the nervous system we talked about last semester utilizes neurons, that was the cells, and they release neurotransmitters as their chemical message to get across to their target cells, which are either postsynaptic neuron or muscle fibers, tissues, and glands that we talked about. What differs between the nervous system and the endocrine system is that for the nervous system, neurotransmitters are not released into the bloodstream, but into that very tiny space that we saw in our models last semester of the neuromuscular junction, how tiny that little thing is, that little gap is. So that tiny space was called the synaptic cleft, and hence their target cells cannot be far away. Okay, they have to be very close with this presynaptic neuron in order for synaptic communication to work properly. So that's one difference. Okay, so they have to be very close. Okay, very close, and signal will travel very rapidly. Okay, which also means what I was talking about is that the speed of the delivery message has to be a lot faster, because we're just talking about a tiny little gap that chemical has to get across. So the release, whether it is the release of neurotransmitter or traveling of an action potential down the length of a neuron's axon, is just a lot faster. We're talking about effects that are activated within a split of a second. That's how fast it is. For example, in application of crisis management, remember all those reflexes we talked about last semester, removing your hand from the hot pan to save your hand from being burnt, or changing lanes very quickly to avoid being hit by another car. All of those are a split of a second kind of reaction that happens just like that in a snap, okay? And that's not how endocrine system is. Endocrine system, it's a lot slower, take hours, maybe even days sometimes, but the effect is a lot longer. Okay? And because of how neurotransmitter and neurons work, only a small fraction of the body cells are innervated, okay? And the effects are usually very specific and short-lived, okay? Specific and short-lived, and we're talking about split-second type of deal when we're talking about synaptic communication compared with endocrine communication. And that's why there's those enzymes we talked about, like the acetylcholinesterase or monoamine oxidase. Remember, acetylcholine esterase removes acetylcholine from the synaptic cleft. Monoamine oxidase remove norepinephrine from synaptic cleft. So those work pretty quickly to get rid of those neurotransmitter. So until it's ready for another action potential that's going to come through and release more neurotransmitter. On the other hand, a freely circulating hormone around the bloodstream can remain functional for up to an hour, or even though some can be as short as 2 minutes, but still, we're talking about a lot longer than a few parts of a second for the nervous system. And some hormones can actually circulate around your body for weeks, and we'll talk about why those can be in a bit. For hormones, they are inactivated so in a sense, just like how neurotransmitter can be gotten rid of by those enzymes that digest them in the synaptic cleft, or they will diffuse away on their own. Same thing with hormones. They need to be inactivated somehow too. Usually they may diffuse out of the bloodstream and bind to the own receptor, which is their whole purpose of these hormones. They can be absorbed or broken down by liver and kidney cells, which was what I was talking about. They can even, the liver does a lot of things for us. We'll learn about more about the liver in another chapter when we talk about the digestive system. But the liver does a whole bunch of variety of functions. It's kind of like the whole hypothalamus of the nervous system. How I said the hypothalamus kind of step their foot into everything your body does. The liver is kind of similar too. It kind of steps its foot into everything else that happens in the body. Okay, there's some immunity involved in the liver. There's some a lot of protein synthesis involved. There's neutralization involved. There's detoxification involved. A lot of things happens in the liver, and including getting rid of those extra hormones that's no longer needed. We'll talk about in the metabolism chapter how the liver also is involved with, transport of our cholesterol. So the liver kind of like have its foot in everything in our body. Almost every chapter we'll talk a little bit about the liver. And then the kidney is in charge of filtering our blood. So if there's extra hormones we don't need, kidney cells can get rid of them for us. Okay. The hormones can also be broken down by enzymes in the blood or interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid meaning those fluid that's surrounding your cells. Okay, we'll talk more about the relationship between bloodstream versus interstitial fluid. Okay, that's one of the main theme of the blood vessel chapter, and also when we get to fluid and electrolytes later on in the semester. But interstitial fluid, blood will have enzymes that can get rid of these freely circulating hormones when we don't need them. Now, there are also some specific hormones that are bound to what's called transport proteins. And these actually makes hormone able to last a lot longer than just a few hours within the bloodstream. We're talking about even days and weeks, okay? For example, in the case of thyroid hormone and steroid hormones, they can circulate in our body for weeks. I'll talk about how thyroid hormone is made and, what we mean by freely circulating thyroid hormone versus bound thyroid hormone when we get to the thyroid gland in a bit. Now, these transport proteins bound hormones is kind of acting like a quick access reserve in the bloodstream. So when we run out of freely circulating hormones, we don't have to wait around for specific endocrines to make more. Remember from last semester how I talked about creatine phosphate kind of acting like that quick ATP reserve in our muscle cells, so we don't have to wait for cellular respiration to do its job all the time. We have some reserve already waiting for us, for us to use. Same thing for hormones. Okay, there's those that are freely circulating that's being used by your body, but when we run out of those, we can depend on the hormones that's bound to these transport proteins, and they will release them whenever we need them. So there's usually some sort of an equilibrium in terms of hormone concentrations between those that are freely circulating and those hormones that are bound by proteins. As free hormones are removed, inactivated, more bound hormones will be released. Thus, there's always several weeks supply of bound hormones when we talk about hormones that are bound by these transport proteins. Okay, which is why if you have, for example, in thyroid diseases, it takes a while for the drug to take effect. And if we think about hyperthyroidism is when your thyroid gland makes too much thyroid hormone, and there are medications that can actually inhibit that process and stop the production of the thyroid hormone within your thyroid gland. Now, it's not magical where you take the medication one day and the next day all the thyroid hormones are gone, because technically speaking, in your bloodstream there's weeks of supply of thyroid hormone still there, which means it may take weeks before you start to see the decreasing amount of thyroid hormones in the body. And that's why in the beginning, your endocrinologist doctor will usually tell you, we got to see you, we put you on this medication. I need to see you back 2 weeks. And then I will need to check your blood again for your thyroid hormone levels. Is because we need to see whether the medication is working properly within those time. It's not that they want you to come all the time. It's just that you need to, in the beginning, you need to find that the correct adjustment in medication that can lead to a person with hyperthyroidism to come back down on their thyroid levels. And we don't know whether the medication works unless we allow for those weeks to take effect. Okay? It's not that the drug takes so long to take effect. We're waiting for those week supply of thyroid hormones to be broken down, okay? Or to be used up. All right. So once a hormone is released from an endocrine gland, it will enter the bloodstream and keep floating around until it is recognized by a specific hormone receptor on the surface of a cell in a particular organ and bind to it. Okay, that's the whole thing. His whole point. It's kind of like that substrate and enzyme relationship. Okay, it's just now we're talking about a receptor and a hormone relationship. And usually a hormone can bind to a certain receptor, just like this, is because there are these active sites on these receptors protein that specifically bind a certain hormone, which is why it says, sometimes you can have that hormone floating around, but only 1 or 2 organs is activated, because only those 1 or 2 organs have these specific protein receptors for that specific hormone. Okay? All right. So there are several things that can happen downstream once the hormone binds to a receptor. One thing it can do is it can alter genetic activity, which means it can activate genes, or sometimes it can inhibit a gene, okay, depending on what the hormone is supposed to do. Second, they can affect the rate of protein synthesis. Sometimes that particular hormone can actually activate transcription within the nucleus and hence translation within the cytoplasm of that particular gene. And thirdly, it can also sometimes change membrane permeability. For example, upon binding to a certain hormone, another channel for something else can turn on or turn off. Okay, maybe a channel for glucose, for example, which was what I was talking about with insulin. When insulin binds to its receptor and enhances the cell's capability of absorbing glucose. Maybe a certain glucose gets activated, open up for glucose to come into the cell. Okay. So cells from different organs will have their specific set of receptors for different hormones, but as I've mentioned, the function of the hormone is not determined by the nature of the hormone itself, but it is the cell or tissue that determines the function of the hormone. Okay, so one hormone, that's why, can have different effects on different tissues. Okay, so these receptors are what binds with the hormone. Okay, and they're kind of sitting like that within the plasma membrane for hormones to bind to. Okay, so some hormone receptors are located on the outside within the plasma membrane of cells. Those hormones are called extracellular receptors. Okay, extra usually means outside. Cellular, so outside a cell. Okay, and for these type of receptors, extracellular receptors, they are usually kind of embedded within the plasma membrane, just like this particular example here. And then while other receptors can be located on the inside of the cell, whether it be in the cytoplasm or even within the nucleus itself. Those are called intracellular receptor. Intra means inside, cellular, so inside the cell. So for extracellular receptors, the hormones that bind to these are usually not lipid soluble, which makes sense. Remember, we talked about membrane permeability last semester, way in the beginning. We talked about this in the cell chapter, how if you are able to cross the plasma membrane, it's because you are lipid soluble and can get across the hydrophobic part of the plasma membrane. So those that are extracellular receptor means that probably that hormone can't pass, which is why you have receptors for them located on top of the plasma membrane. Okay. Two examples of hormones that bind to extracellular receptors are insulin, for activating glucose absorption, or oxytocin. We kind of talked about this a little bit slightly last semester, but it is for activating uterine contraction or milk ejection for mothers. When I talked about positive feedback last semester, I mentioned oxytocin, that is the hormone that is released from the mom's hypothalamus so that you can induce that uterine contraction during labor or delivery, or when the baby sucks on the mom's breast. It also induces the milk to be ejected from the mother's nipples. Okay, so similar to what we have seen in special senses chapter last semester, endocrine pathway for extracellular receptors will require three things. You need a first messenger, which is the hormone itself, to bind to the receptor. You need something called a G protein. Usually it's some sort of enzyme complex that is coupled to the receptor. You see how this is a G protein, and is what couple means, that is stuck there. Okay, it's stuck together with the protein receptor. That's what coupled means. So that when the protein receptor gets activated, it also activates the G protein, because they're highly related to physically touching each other, and that's why this can trigger an activation of the G protein when protein receptors have their hormone binding. Okay. Third thing it needs is second messenger, which is usually we call it some sort of an intermediary molecules, which is generated for further downstream effects. Okay, for example, cyclic AMP is a common second messenger. Cyclic GMP is a common second messenger, or even calcium ions. And we kind of saw cyclic AMP and cyclic GMP when we were talking about those special senses. If you remember from olfaction, I talked about how the odorant binding is what's going to activate adenylene cyclase, which will then change in your AMP into cyclic AMP, and then that's what's going to trigger opening of the sodium channels, triggering depolarization, allowing the olfactory smell to come through as an electrical impulse from your olfactory neuron towards your olfactory cortex. Okay. So it's kind of like similar to that, except now we're not talking about neurons. We're just talking about hormones and receptor cells. Okay, so that's why those kind of mechanisms and pathway, it's pretty similar when we talk about signaling pathway of the human body. All right. So we talked about a similar pathway also in taste buds. Okay, remember we talked about gustosins last semester and how gustosins are able to bind to particular tastes such as sweetness, your umami taste, and your umami sweetness, okay, which is glucose, umami, which is your glutamine, and aspartame. Okay, those can bind to your gustosins, which then triggers, okay, your secondary messenger to relay the signal of taste to your brain. Okay, and then the third one was alkaloids for bitter, okay, sense of bitter. So those three things were what's going to activate your gustosins to activate further downstream second messenger, which was similar to what this is about. It's just that now it is hormone. Okay, so if cyclic AMP is used as a second messenger, here's an example of that chemical pathway that can be activated upon binding to a hormone. So first, the G protein will activate that same enzyme we talked about, adenylene cyclase. Adenylene cyclase will convert ATP into cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP then will activate a kinase. And remember, I mentioned this a few times that whenever an enzyme is called a kinase, it has to do with phosphorylation, okay, which means it puts a phosphate group onto something to either change its shape or activate it in a certain way, okay. So kinase causes phosphorylation, okay, when the effect on target cells depend on the nature of those phosphorylated protein, whatever it is, okay. It can open ion channels because now you phosphorylate it, changed its shape, so it opened up something, changed its structure, or it can activate enzymes upon phosphorylation. Sometimes phosphorylation can inactivate things, but sometimes it can activate things. Okay, so plasma membrane proteins can open those ion channels, or glycogen phosphorylase is an enzyme that can release glucose from glycogen in muscles and liver. For example, when we're running low of blood glucose around our bloodstream, then we go down to our glycogen reserves within our muscle cells and liver cells, and how we can release those glucose again one by one from glycogen molecule is via this particular enzyme called glycogen phosphorylase right here. Okay, so those are a couple examples of what hormones can trigger to happen within certain cells. Now, just that, and I said cyclic AMP can also be inactivated by another enzyme called phosphodiesterase. And this is not the first time you saw this enzyme. You saw this enzyme when we talked about vision in chapter 17. Remember how we talked about your vision rods, okay, your photoreceptor rods are constantly activated. They're constantly doing depolarization. It is only when it stops, that's when the signal goes through to your brain that there is a reception of light somewhere within the retina layer of the eye. And PDE, phosphodiesterase, was involved with that process where the activated opsin from rhodopsin will cause another enzyme to activate, and that other enzyme will cause PDE to be activated and get rid of that signal for causing depolarization, which then tells your brain that you have that reception of light. Okay, so in this case, it's the same thing. The enzyme here is going to get rid of something for us, which is cyclic AMP. When you get rid of cyclic AMP, that will reduce, that may result in reduced enzyme activity to inhibit a certain process. So it all depends what that cell has and what is, that can be the same hormone here, but in different cells, it can lead to very different effects depending what G protein is activated and what does it do in response, okay? All right. Okay, so, and just as we had signals in the nervous system that result in either depolarization and hyperpolarization, we talked about how endocrine hormones can be activated and inhibited in a certain way, okay? All right, so for intracellular receptors, they involve hormones that has the capability of entering into a cell. That's the whole point of being intracellular receptor, meaning that very receptors inside the cell, and the fact that they're inside the cell like this, either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus, that means the hormone can actually cross the plasma membrane, which means these hormones are usually lipid soluble in order for them to cross that plasma membrane. And the specific receptors they bind to, like I said, can be either in the cytoplasm or within the nucleus. For example, steroid hormones like estrogen can enter into breast tissue cells, and there can be receptors either within the cytoplasm like this, okay? And that's why you see this 4 rings. Remember, we talked about this in macromolecules, both in general biology 1406 and 2401. These 4 carbon ring structure is a signature of steroid molecules, which is a type of lipid that we talked about as a macromolecule. And because they're lipid, that's why they can cross freely inside. And estrogen, testosterone, we talked about, are examples of steroid hormones. So they can go through into those receptors within the cytoplasm or go through to the receptors within the nucleus to activate a gene and consequently transcription of particular proteins, such as, if we're going back to that same story about breast tissues, how in puberty, women all of a sudden starts having growth in breast tissue is because when females enter puberty, they start making estrogen, okay? And estrogen hormone can bind and go into the cell, bind to those receptors, and they can increase adipose tissue, okay, formation, which is why the breast enlarges, and lactation ducts and glands are also activated within the breast. Those can all be happening due to this transcription process within the female's body because now they're generating estrogen as a hormone, okay, when they reach puberty. So that's just one example of steroid hormone. Another example of hormones that bind to intracellular receptors are thyroid hormones right here. Okay, so this is a thyroid hormone, T3 or T4, that we'll talk about in a bit, last part of the lecture. This has to do with metabolism. Thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, usually regulates how fast we're digesting stuff, okay? And hence, its target receptors can be mitochondria within the cytoplasm for enhancing ATP production, because when we talk about metabolism, not only are we talking about digestion, but also talking about cellular respiration, more so in that format. When we're talking about metabolism, we're not talking about how fast your stomach is breaking down food particles. We're talking about how fast glucose is turned into ATP. That's what metabolism refers to. And within the cytoplasm, the thyroid hormone can actually enhance the ATP production using the mitochondria by activating the mitochondria or another receptor within the nucleus here for activation of specific genes and proteins that are critical for metabolism and growth. Okay. And that's why thyroid hormones is usually important for growth in a child. Okay, and we talked about that last semester when I was talking about how a child didn't grow just because that child was unable to generate thyroid hormones. Okay, and she was a 30-year-old that was trapped in this 2-year-old body is because without thyroid hormone, you cannot, the child couldn't grow to their potential height and size because that's the role of thyroid hormones in an individual, which is also why pregnant moms that are going through hypothyroidism is a serious matter because it can result in no growth of the embryo itself, because the embryo also relies on thyroid hormones from the mom in order for the embryo to continue to grow. Okay? All right. So organs of the endocrine system can either be made up of endocrine or exocrine cells. I kind of mentioned this last semester, okay, and in some cases, some endocrine organs actually have both endocrine and exocrine cells. And what do we mean by these two types of cells? Endocrine cells are glandular secretory cells that release secretion directly into the extracellular fluid. Whereas exocrine cells, they would secrete products into epithelial surface by way of ducts. Okay, so exocrine means they require a duct of some sort in order to get to their destination. Endocrine cells, you don't need a duct. Okay, those go straight into the bloodstream, diffuses into the bloodstream, and then circulate around the bloodstream to get to their final destination. Now, pancreas is the perfect example that contains both endocrine and exocrine cells, where its endocrine cells are in charge of releasing insulin and glucagon into the bloodstream, that we'll talk about later in the lecture, while exocrine cells of the pancreas are in charge of releasing other products into the small intestines for digestive purposes. And we will talk about that more in detail when we get to chapter 24 on the digestive system. But we will kind of slightly gloss over, its exocrine cells versus endocrine cells within the pancreas later in lecture. Okay, we'll focus mainly on these primary endocrine organs for this chapter. You see all of these in purple boxes. All of these ones are considered as primary endocrine organ because usually they have a big role in the endocrine system, or the fact that that's their only role in our body. Okay. There are other organs that are called secondary endocrine organs. Okay, we'll get to the functions and hormones of these secondary organs when we get to those specific chapters for cardiovascular system, immune system, digestive system, urinary, and reproductive. That's what all of these will get into and sort of touch on when we get to those areas. But for this chapter, we'll just focus on these primary endocrine organs here. Okay, but we will mention these again when we get to those particular chapters, when they are the star of that chapter: cardiovascular system, immune system, digestive system, etc. Okay, all right. So let's get started with the most superior endocrine organ, and we have already mentioned this particular organ last semester for the brain: the hypothalamus. If you recall, one of the 7 functions I described last semester for the hypothalamus is that it serves as a middle guy or middleman that connects the nervous system with the endocrine system. So here we will talk about its endocrine functions now. We'll zoom in on its endocrine stuff. So the hypothalamus, located right below the thymus, Remember that this circle thing within the brain, I talked about that is the thalamus. So that Twin Peak mountain looking thing, I said I refer that to as the triangular Twin Peak thing. That is the hypothalamus. And it's called the hypothalamus because it sits right underneath that oval shaped thalamus within the brain. Okay, so this whole part here is a zoom in view of this. And this here is what the hypothalamus is. Okay, so it is located right below the thalamus and is physically connected to the pituitary gland, which is this one right here, via a sort of a slender funnel-shaped structure called infundibulum. Okay, so that's this part right here. Okay, this part, that's the infundibulum. If we remember that in some of our models from last semester on the brain, you saw that right underneath the hypothalamus, there was that gland right underneath it, and that was the pituitary. Okay, and that's why hypothalamus and pituitary gland are in that close physical relationship where they can function properly for the endocrine system. Pituitary gland is like the master gland of the whole endocrine system, but yet it is still relying on hypothalamus to tell it what to do, in a sense, okay? Because ultimately your endocrine system doesn't know what to do, okay? The nervous system has to tell the endocrine system what to do, and that's how the hypothalamus come into play. Hypothalamus a lot of times will release something that tells the pituitary gland what to do. So if you have something that doesn't work properly in the hypothalamus, your pituitary gland may not work properly, okay? And you'll see what I mean in a bit. I'll talk about their relationship. All right, so one of the hypothalamus' main function is to regulate both anterior, which is this portion right here, anterior part of the pituitary gland, and posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Okay, they're actually given specific names. I'll talk about that next. Okay, so where the pituitary gland is known, like I said, as the master gland of the endocrine system, and why we call it that is because the pituitary gland itself will control many other endocrine systems. So the big boss is your hypothalamus, and then the boss below that, okay, is your pituitary gland, and then you have all your little workers down below, which is your pancreas, adrenal gland, etc. Okay, all right. So as for the hypothalamus, we talked about how it integrates the activities of the nervous system and the endocrine system, and it does this in 3 ways. We kind of talked about it last semester already when I mentioned the hypothalamus function. If you remember that hypothalamus itself will make 2 hormones. One was called ADH, okay, antidiuretic hormone, and the other one is OXT, which is oxytocin. Okay, so they are produced by the hypothalamus, and they use neurons. You see these green guys right here, okay? Those are actually neurons, okay? And these green fibers going down into the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is what allows those proteins or hormones to be relayed and travel via the axons of these of the hypothalamus to go into the posterior lobe, and posterior lobe of the pituitary gland then will release those signals into your circulatory system. Okay, so that's how hormones within the hypothalamus can get to your circulatory system, is via the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland actually does not make any hormone. It just relays what it needs to relay from the hypothalamus, and these 2 specific hormones that it relays are ADH and OXT, and I'll talk about their functions in a bit. The other important function of the hypothalamus in terms of the endocrine system, like I said, it's hypothalamus is the big boss, okay? So they will secrete what's called regulatory hormones or release hormone that will control the secretory activities of the endocrine cells within the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The anterior lobe of the pituitary gland here actually produces a whole bunch of different hormones, but those hormones won't do anything. They won't be released unless it receives the correct signal from the hypothalamus. Okay, so that's why hypothalamus role controls that for the anterior pituitary gland. And the last thing it does is that it will contain autonomic center that direct neural control over the endocrine cells of the adrenal medulla. Okay, remember we talked about this as chapter 16 when we wrapped up the semester of 2401. Like I said, that's why I wrapped up chapter 16 as our last chapter, because I will continuously refer back to it in AMP2. Okay, and here it is now. We talked about how the sympathetic ganglion, actually one of the synapse location was the adrenal medulla itself. Okay, and hence it is actually there are neurons from the hypothalamus that will relay that signal to the adrenal medulla for activation of your fight or flight response, okay, which is involving epinephrine and norepinephrine as your neurotransmitter released by the adrenal medulla to activate your sympathetic nervous system, okay? So these are the 3 ways that the hypothalamus can integrate the nervous system and the endocrine system, okay? And adrenal gland, of course, is an endocrine organ. Okay. All right, so hence the next main endocrine organ we will discuss is the pituitary gland. It is divided into the anterior portion and the posterior portion. The anterior portion of the pituitary gland, there's a fancy name. Okay, that's the way with, biology. A lot of times I like to call it the fancy name, but it's medically correct to call, medical terminology is really what it is. But fancy name for it. So fancy name for anterior pituitary gland is adenohypophysis. Okay, and an easy way to remember this, at least for me, is that the adeno starts with an A. Okay, so for me, the A stands for anterior, and hypophysis is actually a good word to remember because whenever you see hypophysis, it usually refers to the pituitary gland. I talked about this for my 2401 students last semester, how there's just so many medical terminologies, and this is only the beginning with AMP class. The more you go into your health professions program, the more medical terminologies you'll see. And for every medical terminology out there, it's just kind of tough to remember so many words all at once. So I try to teach my students to come up with something, okay, that you can relate to the word. And whenever you remember that little story or that word for that letter, for that represents something about the definition of the word, you'll never forget it. Okay, so adenohypophysis, A for anterior, hypophysis, something to do with the pituitary gland. Okay. And the adenohypophysis is divided into 3 other regions. Pars distalis, which is this region right here. This whole thing is called the pars distalis. Pars tuberalis is this little guy right here that wraps around the infundibulum, okay? It's kind of like a little hand that wraps around that part to make sure that it stays together and it is in functional connection physically together, because we're going to have to rely on these signal coming from the hypothalamus to reach the anterior pituitary gland or the adenohypophysis. Pars intermedia is this thin region right there. It's a narrow band that kind of separates the adenohypophysis with the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And we'll learn in the next slide, the next couple slides, that this is called the neurohypophysis. Okay, so easy way to remember these 3 places. Distalis, okay, pars distal, pars you just have to remember, okay. Distalis, which means disto, if you remember from last semester. Disto means away from the center of the body, right? So this is kind of away from the central part of the pituitary gland, okay. So that's why this is the distalis. Tuberalis sounds like a tube, okay? So it wraps around that tube that connects the hypothalamus with the pituitary gland. Intermedia is the easiest, okay? Intermedia, the name itself speaks for what it does. It is in the middle, okay? It separates something. So it's got to be that little white portion here that is the intermediate of your adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis, something in the middle, okay? And this little part in the middle actually specifically make a certain adenohypophysis hormone, which is MSH. And I'll talk about the function of that hormone in the next couple slides, okay? Now, before I get to the functions of the hormones and what hormones the adenohypophysis make, there is something interesting I have to introduce here. Within the pituitary gland, there exists a very unique set of capillaries called the portal system. Okay, there are two main portal systems in the body. One is in the pituitary gland, and the other one is in the liver. Okay, and we'll talk about the one in the liver when we get to the cardiovascular system. But the one in the pituitary gland is called the hypophyseal portal system. Again, that's why I said it's useful to remember the word hypophysis, because it is usually related to the pituitary gland. So if you remember adenohypophysis is for the pituitary gland, then you will for sure know hypophyseal portal system. What is it we're referring to? Okay, it's got to be the pituitary gland. Okay, and why portal systems are unique is because they connect one capillary network to another capillary network via what's called portal vessels. Okay. And why this is unique, okay, is you will learn when we get to the cardiovascular system, is that blood will always flow in one direction. Okay, you have arteries, and then it will flow to capillaries, and then it will flow into the veins. Okay, so I'll write that down. Okay, so arteries, blood will always flow from arteries to capillaries, and then to veins. Okay, you'll have to know this anyway eventually when we get to the cardiovascular system. Okay, so that doesn't change. Blood from the veins won't back up into the capillaries, or else then we're in trouble. Okay, the whole point of why blood serves as our main transport system is because they travel in this route without fail. Okay, and how we can pick up important stuff, like oxygen, okay, from the lungs to your capillaries, and capillary then deliver those oxygen to your tissues, and then once the blood becomes deoxygenated, pick up carbon dioxide, it goes to your veins and go back to the arteries. Okay, so that you can drop off carbon dioxide back into your lungs, and lungs will give you oxygen in return. And again, the cycle begins again. Okay, so that's usually how blood travels. So what's special about portal system is that blood don't travel from capillary to vein. Okay, you have this particular system right here where it travels from one network of capillaries to another network of capillaries. This does not happen other than where we have a portal system. Why is that important? Okay, why do we have to have capillary to capillary? Well, it's because it is for a very critical function of distributing hormones between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Remember I said your big boss is hypothalamus. Pituitary gland needs to rely on getting the commands correctly from the hypothalamus in form of those hormones. Okay, so it is much more direct for hormones to travel straight from via these capillaries here from the hypothalamus directly into the pituitary gland, adenohypophysis specifically. Okay, the portal system doesn't exist for the between hypothalamus and neurohypophysis. There is no portal system here. The hypophyseal portal system only exists between the hypothalamus and the adenohypophysis. Okay, so that's why you see these blue vessels here connecting this capillary system of the hypothalamus and this capillary network within the adenohypophysis. Neurohypophysis relies on neurons instead for those two important hormones that the hypothalamus needs to get to the circulatory system. So that's why it doesn't need the portal system, okay? But for adenohypophysis, it needs that portal system for direct route of traveling of hormones between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, adenohypophysis specifically. Without the existence of this portal system, technically speaking, the hormones made by the hypothalamus that needs to get to adenohypophysis need to first travel from its capillary network into veins, and then from veins it will have to travel back to arteries, and then finally maybe it will drain back into the capillary of the pituitary gland. Okay, so it needs to go around this whole cycle here that I've drawn. In order, for example, if this was capillaries of the hypothalamus with its hormone supposed to be for pituitary gland, instead of traveling straight to the adenohypophysis, which is right there, it will have to go to veins, arteries, and come back to the carp capillary of the adenohypophysis. It's a long route, okay? Not only is it not efficient, but it is also has the chance that those hormones will be diluted out in the circulatory system itself. So if it's right next to each other, why not connect the two together? Okay, so that's why there's this portal system to ensure that all the hormones within the hypothalamic hormones, go straight into the adenohypophysis before being diluted or mixed with the general circulation of your cardiovascular system. Okay, so that's why we need this portal system, so that we can have that direct route for the commands coming from the hypothalamus to get to your master gland, adenohypophysis. All right. So it goes straight to their destination. Okay. And here's what the relationship is between hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. What are some of those hypothalamus hormones that control adenohypophysis? These are just a few illustrated in this image here. But as a group, okay, the hormones that's released by the hypothalamus to trigger release of other hormones from your adenohypophysis, as a group, they are called release hormone, okay? And that's why you see that all of these hormones here are abbreviated with an RH at the end, because they all end with release hormone, okay? And they are mainly for activating release of other hormones made within the adenohypophysis. And then those hormones released from the adenohypophysis will then stimulate other targeted endocrine organs further downstream, and those endocrine organs will finally produce their specific hormones for the specific function of the body. Okay, so that's why this chart right here is a very good diagram for you to remember. Okay, it illustrates this concept. It's kind of like the chain of command hierarchy chart, okay, that you see at a company, okay? So the CEO of the company is your hypothalamus right here, okay? And then it will give its message or task in form of these hormones. And then they will go down to their individual employees down here, whether you're ovary, testicle, or your adrenal cortex, or you're a thyroid gland, okay? And that's how things are relayed. It has to come from your CEO and then your next boss, okay, which is the pituitary gland, and then on to the individual employees that will then make the main hormones for the actual function of that particular part, okay? Usually for homeostasis of some sort, okay? So you start with the hypothalamus making these different releasing hormones, which will then stimulate the adenohypophysis to make these different hormones within hormone 1 group right here, which will then stimulate the specific endocrine organs right here that will make these different hormones for you within the hormone 2 group, okay? I'll go over each of these pathways with you, since eventually you will have to learn it anyway, okay? So for the first pathway here, right here, you start with TRH, which stands for thyrotropin releasing hormone. Just for the fact that it begins with thyro, okay, it probably is relating to the thyroid gland, okay? And notice that all hormones are produced by the hypothalamus, ends with that RH, okay? So if it's RH releasing hormone, usually means it is something that is released by the hypothalamus, okay? All right, so the TRH here will travel to the adenohypophysis thanks to your portal system, your hypophyseal portal system, that you can directly do that. And then they will bind to a particular group of cells within the adenohypophysis that will produce another hormone called the thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH for abbreviation, okay? And TSH will then travel to the circulatory system and arrive at their target organs, okay, which is the thyroid gland. And when TSH binds to your thyroid gland, it will stimulate your thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone such as T3 and T4, okay? Triiodothyronine or thyroxine. We'll talk about that in a bit when we get to the thyroid gland, okay? So you see that there's a lot of abbreviation here. I usually tell my students it's up to you whether you want to remember the entire name or the abbreviation, okay? For example, for lab practical, it's free response, okay? It's fill in the blank. If you misspell an abbreviation, I'm going to have to mark it wrong completely because I don't know which one you're referring to. TSH and TRH is two very different hormones, but yet they're only differ by one letter. So I can't give you partial credit for abbreviation. But if you know the entire word and you wrote something close to the entire word, then I can give you partial credit, okay? And a lot of times, knowing what the long word stands for these hormones, usually it tells you what it does, okay? So sometimes knowing the long name of the hormone also gives you a clue for what function that hormone will do, okay? For example, here it was about thyrotropin releasing hormone, okay? I can write that down for you. Thyrotropin. Okay, thyrotropin releasing hormone, okay? And the thyro part already tells you that it's something to do with thyroid gland, okay? And this stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. The name itself tells you what it does. It stimulates the thyroid to make thyroid hormones, okay? So it's up to you what you want to remember for your own, when you're studying for the exam or the lab practical on the endocrine system. There's just a lot of abbreviations and a lot of hormones and glands to remember. So, I usually suggest remembering the entire word so you know what it stands for and what it does already from the name itself, okay? All right. So the next pathway here, right here, has to do with the adrenal gland, okay? CRH, that's released by your hypothalamus right here. It stands for corticotropin releasing hormone, okay? Again, it tells you what it does, okay? Corticotropin, okay, is actually corticotropic hormones are what's made within the adrenal cortex, okay? And that's why the fact that it starts with corticotropin, you know it has something to do with your adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland, okay? Remember, the adrenal gland is separated into two main regions. One is the adrenal cortex, one is the adrenal medulla. Remember, I kind of drew this out last semester. Adrenal gland kind of sits like a little triangle on top of your kidneys right here. Okay, kidney. And this is the triangle that sits on top. This is the adrenal gland. And if we zoom in to this triangle, you'll be able to see that it's separated into two regions. The outer border of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal cortex. Okay, so this whole region here is called the adrenal cortex. The middle part right here is called the adrenal medulla. Okay, and they produce very different hormones. Okay, so the adrenal medulla, as we have learned already, is for making epinephrine and norepinephrine for fight or flight response, activation of sympathetic nervous system. Adrenal cortex makes makes a whole range of variety of hormones, and they're technically as a group called corticotropic hormone, which is why the hypothalamus for this hormone is called corticotropin releasing hormone, because it acts on ultimately your adrenal cortex to release hormones from the adrenal cortex. Okay, so corticotropin releasing hormone will induce your adenohypophysis to produce ACTH. ACTH stands for adrenal corticotropic hormone. Wow, even more specific. Now you exactly know what it does. Adrenal for adrenal gland, corticotropic for corticotropic hormone. Okay. So adrenal corticotropic hormone, ACTH, then that will travel to the adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal cortex, okay? Because the adrenal medulla is, what activates the adrenal medulla is not your via the hormone that's released by the hypothalamus. There are neurons that specifically goes from there toward your adrenal gland. Okay, so those were the preganglionic fibers of those neurons that synapse on the adrenal medulla for that production of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So for hormones produced within the adrenal cortex, it is regulated by this particular pathway. Okay. And as this one group of hormones that the adrenal cortex makes is called glucocorticoids. Okay, we'll talk about three main groups of hormones that the adrenal cortex makes when we get to the adrenal gland. Just because, they actually make a handful of hormones, and you already have a lot of hormones to remember. So we're not going to go over every one specific one of those hormones that the adrenal cortex make, but we will divide them into groups, okay? And glucocorticoids is one of those groups, okay? All right. Okay, and lastly, for the organs of the reproductive system, which is right here, these two pathway, it was, the hypothalamus will make something called GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone, gonadal, okay, which means it has to do with gonads. And gonads of the body are your sex organ, which is, your testes and ovaries as being part of it, okay? Because they're important for making your sex cells, either sperm or your egg. So gonadotropin releasing hormones stimulate your adenohypophysis to make either two different hormones, FSH or LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH stands for luteinizing hormone. Okay, we'll come back to these hormones when we get to the reproductive system. So it's a good idea to kind of remember them now, because you will only get back to it when we get to the reproductive system. Now, both of these hormones, FSH and LH, act on either the male's testes or the female's ovaries. Okay, both of these will act on both male and female, but they are for different purposes. We'll learn in the reproductive system chapter that FSH stimulates sperm production for the males, whereas for females, they will stimulate egg maturation. Okay, LH, on the other hand, will stimulate production of male sex hormone, which is as a group, it's called androgens. That's what androgens means, is male sex hormone. And then for ovaries, LH will stimulate the ovaries to make female sex hormone, progesterone and estrogen. And the other thing LH is important for is for ovulation purposes. For the egg to burst out of your ovaries, you need the spike in your LH hormone in order for that to occur. Okay, so that's something that we'll talk about when we get to the reproductive system. But it comes back to endocrine, which is why we start the semester off with the endocrine system, because everything that happens in all the other systems rely on your endocrine system for signaling and communication in order for the other organ system to do its job. Okay, so that's why I said the overall function of nervous system and endocrine system kind of goes hand in hand in maintaining homeostasis of the body. Okay, so let's take a break here for part 1. It's been an hour, a little bit over an hour, and then we'll come back to part 2 to finish up the chapter.